Welcome back to Logo Legends, the sports podcast on teams' branding, logos, and identities throughout their history. My name is Kasabe. New episodes are every Thursday on my YouTube channel with visualizations, and we're also found on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thank you for listening. This is episode number 5. And so far we've covered the 4 major North American pro sports leagues, the NHL, NFL, NBA, and MLB. And before we continue into some more specific team histories, I just wanted to take a few episodes and talk about the logo landscape, or just how branding has kind of evolved throughout the years and gotten to where we are more recently. So this episode will be a bit shorter than the next one. This is kind of a preface into next week, and I'm gathering a little bit more information for that, since it'll involve some audience participation. We'll be kind of doing some polls on Twitter, kind of asking what you guys think about this to kind of go over our findings, so to speak. But I wanted to bring up something that's been really prevalent in the last decade or so. That's the fact that logos, or just branding in general, has gotten a whole lot simpler. And not necessarily in sports. We've seen this a lot with corporate branding as well. So as technology gets more advanced and you have more digital technology, programs, even AI that can spit out art at the click of a button, why is it that we're just moving towards a more simplistic approach? So I brought it up in my first episode, and simplicity is very important to a logo. You do want to make that connection before the other criteria are met. So I'm all for logos being simple and being recognizable, but I think as a society, we might be kind of trending to the point where logos are almost too simple. As far as the evolution of logos go, about 50 years ago, a lot of what you see for uniforms, logos, branding was done by hand. We kind of talked about it in episode 1. And the Milwaukee Brewers, how they had a university student design their first logo. They didn't have firms or a lot of resources dedicated to this sort of thing back then. I would say this lasted until about the 80s or 90s for the most part, which is right around the time that computer and technology was starting to at least kind of sink into the public's eye. It wasn't really heavily used at that point, but there were some origins back then. Right around the 90s, there was a huge paradigm shift in society about counterculture and designing just anything in general. So I grew up in the 90s. I might be a bit biased, but I kind of liked all of the logos that came out during the 90s, in the NBA especially. Logos were a lot more loud and crass. They were kind of in your face. And, as a young kid back then, that was very impressionable. It really made an impact on somebody like me. There were a wide variety of color palettes too, a lot of secondary colors that you might not expect. And again, I think a lot of this is kind of due to the counterculture movement of the 90s. Society was changing to the point where a lot of youth kind of dared to go outside of societal norms. There was a lot of structure after World War II especially, and not to generalize it too much, but from about the 50s to, I would say, the 80s, maybe mid-80s, society really just told you what was acceptable and what was not. It wasn't until the late 80s or 90s where a lot of people started to want to, reach out and kind of fight the man, so to speak, not violently, but, just kind of show themselves a bit more individually in what they wore, how they represented themselves. So a large majority of this counterculture scene, I think, would be attributed to music and media. MTV was really big at the time, and people were starting to have more underground, hip hop. You had grunge rock. You had a lot of kind of smaller subsets that kind of bled their way into culture. And again, this is also around the time where the internet and other niche avenues of finding culture or media were starting to kind of rise up from the ground. So you had a lot more television channels dedicated to specific things. You had other sources and avenues of finding things online, not YouTube or anything. It was much too early for things like that, but there was just this whole movement of counterculture and trying to set yourself apart from the rest of society in a good way. So if you were outside of society's expectations, you were kind of an outcast. And it was around that time that people just really didn't start to care anymore. They kind of started to embrace the fact that they were an outsider. So for a few years, I would say the late 80s, media had some pushback. There was a little bit of back and forth for this movement, but after a while, I think it started to become evident to a lot of media and corporate businesses that, hey, all right, this is something that's kind of here to stay, and we're going to need to start advertising or finding ways to get through to these outsiders, or the people who are outside of the norm. And that presented a difficult challenge. How do you do something that still appeases the main masses as well as this new audience? So as a result, a lot of teams went away from their traditional logos. Not to say that they abandoned them completely, but they wanted to kind of have more logos that were more vibrant, more energetic to appeal to this new audience. And I think this was best exemplified by the National Basketball Association. In addition to the vibrant colors, a lot of teams went to a big logo on the front of the jersey, which traditionally you just had like a number and the font with the name of your team. Now you had certain teams that had the logo almost take up the entire part of the jersey. The two most popular colors of choice for these jerseys were teal and purple. So you had teams like the Jazz, the Pistons, the Raptors, the Hornets, the Grizzlies even. Some of those more like expansion level teams, but there were some maybe smaller markets who wanted to go out on a limb and kind of buy into this because their fan base wasn't as traditional as, say, like a New York or Los Angeles. It was around this point that leagues started to embrace alternate jerseys as well. So traditionally you had a home and an away uniform, which is usually white or gray, and then a different team color. Now with the alternate jerseys, not only could you sell those alternate jerseys to the fans as merchandise, but you could wear them to do specific like theme nights throughout the year, for example. Just kind of get that interest going with the fans, have them come out and see like the new uniforms as a part of the game. So introducing alternate jerseys led more people into this kind of trend or fad, whatever you want to call it, of all these vibrant colors, these new uniforms, which in turn gets people to buy into your brand. So there were some teams that were very successful like this, including the Charlotte Hornets. Their jerseys, their teal uniforms were some of the most popular around this time, as well as some of those expansion teams like I mentioned, the Grizzlies and the Raptors. I think a lot of the ability to buy sports merchandise in so many forms nowadays is kind of due to this movement in the 90s. Like you have so many different types, colors, logos to choose from. Back then, you didn't really have the opportunity to buy stuff with a player's name on it. Now you can pick almost any player you want. You can customize, put your own name on some merchandise if you wanted to. So this has really just kind of blown up in the last 20 or 30 years. The in-your-face colors and branding wasn't for everybody though, so there were some teams that still kind of stuck with their traditional values, and there were some teams that even tried to rebrand and just completely fizzled out, like the New York Islanders. They went back to their old logo after a year or two, I think. But introducing these wide varieties of expressing yourself as a fan or a consumer just really launched some of these teams and even the leagues into the forefront of the public eye, the NBA most especially. I mean, again, I was just a few years old in the 90s, and I wasn't some grungy teen looking to fight against the man, but I was a kid who saw these bright, vibrant uniforms, logos, colors, and I bought into it. One of my favorite leagues growing up as a young child was the NBA because it was just so interesting at the time. Part of that was also the talent that was on the court. You had a lot more superstar talent kind of spread across many teams as opposed to some of the super teams that you see today. But having all of that kind of identifiers from one team to the next, having all of these different colors and logos that were easily distinguishable for a kid was really, really cool. And if you're a sports team or any brand really, like having that kind of recognition is something that you should be excited for and build around. So what ended up happening? Why did this movement of vibrancy just kind of die out? Well, as we've kind of gone over, you want to be simplistic with your criteria for a logo, and something that's intense like that, just like in terms of like its loudness, makes a good first impression, but doesn't really leave a lasting impression. So the era of the 90s did fizzle out after a while. I'd say most of it kind of lasted into the mid 2000s, and we started to see another movement towards simplistic logos and different types of branding. I'd say 2005 to 2015 roughly was kind of that return to normalcy. You had a lot of teams that went back to their original branding, tradition, maybe something new completely, but, you know, less in your face than some of the 90s branding. But again, they did have all those alternate uniforms. So if they really wanted to, if the logo was popular enough, but maybe not enough to kind of introduce it into the wide public eye, you do have those theme nights, you do have those alternate jersey, like limited drops that you could bring to the fans. And now in this digital age of social media, which I would put 2015 and later, we're starting to see a lot more people go very simplistic, like almost overly so. So why is it that teams are kind of trending this direction? Why are they going like even more simplistic? I think the main reason for that is the fact that in this digital age, you just have so many different types and avenues of reaching out to people. And you didn't really have this in the 90s with the internet. You had different social medias that different people use. So Facebook started off as younger audiences. Now it's kind of gone over to more older generations. You have new and upcoming social medias that just sometimes come out of thin air. Like TikTok got really popular really fast. Instagram too, Snapchat. Like you have so many different forms of advertising that you have to, as a brand, kind of understand what people want and advertise accordingly. And the challenge with that is you can't change the branding for every single person that goes on your social media. You have to appeal to all of the 60, 70-year-olds as well as the 18-year-olds. So I know in my first episode I went over the 4 criteria for a logo, and that is being simple, clever, appropriate, and recognizable. I think one of the newer ones that's starting to work its way into the fray is consistency. That's the tricky part of today's landscape, is you have to appeal to all audiences, all different types of media, all different forms that people consume your team or your branding on, and maintain a consistent message. I think brands are realizing the best way to do that is to go even more simple, because you have to have all of those logos, all of the branding, all of that kind of theming carry over from one thing to the next. And the best way to do that is to keep it as simple as possible. It's not to save costs. It's not to do anything like that. It's not like people are cheaping out when they're going to these logos, I feel. It's more so, how can we do something like this across different media types and just, not have to redraw something for every single banner that we make for social media, or every single profile picture that's a different size depending on what site you visit. So that's not to say that alternate jerseys or things like the 90s are from a bygone era and they're never coming back. You're always going to have opportunities for marketing and introducing new alternates, logos, uniforms, whatever it be. We have the City Connect uniforms for both baseball and basketball that come out almost annually at this point, I would say. And that's perfectly fine. You can have different ways of expressing your team to different audiences. But the main thing is, now that we've reached this point in the media, social media landscape, teams are going to go more simplistic and then kind of do other things from there as a wing or a branch. It might not look the best, but if you're a corporate brand, this is the way that things are kind of changing and leading their way towards, unless there's just this huge cultural movement like we saw in the 90s where things just completely go off in a different direction. I don't anticipate this changing anytime soon. You can definitely chalk that up to consumerism or capitalism. I mean, they kind of do plan these things out, space everything every few years. So once you start to get maybe a bit old or tired of the old logo, there's some fresh, shiny new thing that comes out, you buy that again. But you can also just kind of pick and choose what kind of suits you, your identity. Kind of throwing it back to the 90s. You had the ability or the option to buy the logos or branding that you thought fit you individually the best. And we're starting to trend in that direction, like I said, where there are different branches or wings where you can purchase things or represent your team the way that you want to. Just as a corporate entity, things are getting a lot more simple because they kind of have to be. It is so hard to maintain that level of consistency across so many different avenues, and that's the reason why teams are trending that direction. But I'd love to know your thoughts about this subject and what you feel is changing over this last 5-10 years, if it's going in a positive direction, or if you feel like there should be a different direction that should be going, if you think that there's something that's missed in regards to kind of this restructuring. Let me know on Twitter. My Twitter name is Kasabe, that's Kasabe, and then compiles with a K. Or if you're watching along on YouTube, be sure to leave me a comment, let me know what you think. But again, this is kind of a preface episode into next week. We'll have a similar topic, but more specifically about uniforms. Next week, we'll be talking about what some of your more favorite and least favorite uniforms have been throughout history and why that is. If you're not following me on Twitter, I do have a poll on there where you can post an image of your favorite and least favorite uniform without any context. I'll be going over some of the results over the next week, kind of analyzing what you guys send me and seeing if there's any patterns or trends that I happen to see for what kind of constitutes your favorite or least favorite. But that'll be all for now. Thank you for listening to Logo Legends, and new episodes every Thursday on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Until next time, take care.